Hear my presentation in getting a copy of the book, I can get it for you at a 20% discount. See me after if you're interested. Okay, The Life of Daniel H. Wells. That quotation is one of his favorites. I find that the more I do, the more ability the Almighty gives me. You'll see as we go through this presentation how that really applied in his life. Daniel H. Wells came from two early families in America, Thomas Wells and Samuel Chapin. Both of them came to Boston in 1635. They weren't the first, but they were among the early ones. And things were still pretty much of a struggle when they got here. Excuse me. Thomas Wells only stayed 1 year in Boston, and then he went about 80 miles to the west and founded Hartford, Connecticut. The brand of Puritans that were in Boston were a little too strict for Thomas, and so he went down to Hartford and helped found a new community there, which eventually became Connecticut Colony, and at the end of his life, he was governor of Connecticut Colony. Then the Wells family moved from Hartford, Connecticut, to Wethersfield in 1636. Walking because they didn't really have any domestic animals other than what they were eating. Wethersfield is only a few miles from Hartford. Now it's in the middle of Hartford. It's actually a suburb, as you see in the lower circle, and Hartford at the top. The grandfathers of Daniel H. Wells were 2 generations after the original immigrants who came from England. That was Joshua Wells and Daniel Wells. Both of them fought in the Revolution. They both joined the same company of Connecticut Volunteers in 1777. Joshua Wells was 51, and Daniel Chapin, that's an error on the screen, Daniel Chapin was 15. They fought together for 3 years through most of the major battles in the New England area. Then David Chapin mustered out and went home to get married. Joshua Wells, who was a widower, stayed and fought through the end of the war and finally mustered out in 1783. And his youngest son, whose name was Daniel Wells, eventually married and moved from Wethersfield in Connecticut clear up into upstate New York, which was then pretty much uninhabited territory because all the people who formerly lived there were loyalists in the Revolution, and most of them had moved to Canada after the war, and those who didn't move to Canada went back to England. So the land was pretty much available up there, and Daniel Wells married Honor Francis in 1799 and moved to Trenton Falls in Oneida County, New York. There's not much of note except farms and the falls in that area. You can't make a living on a waterfall, and so Daniel took up farming. Let me find my pointer. Daniel bought a farm of about 100 acres right there. This is Highway 365 today. Pat and I were at that place a year or so ago, and 200 years after Daniel Wells came there, it's still a farm. We know that that's the farm that Daniel Wells had because this is the schoolhouse that was built on that farm in 1814 and rebuilt in stone in 1825. It sits right on the border between Daniel Wells' farm and the farm of William Storrs. And this is the school that Daniel H. Wells attended as a boy. It's been recently restored by the Wethersfield Historical Group. And when we were there, they were just getting it furnished with a pot-bellied stove and some early schoolroom furnishings. Daniel Wells was born there, sorry, wrong key. Well, before he was born, this is not really the Wells farm, but it's a representation of what a farm in that area at that time might have looked like. And after Daniel Wells and Honor Francis moved there, they had 5 children, as you see on the left and right, born between 1800 and 1812. All of them were girls. Daniel had nobody to help him run the farm. And when the 5th child was born, he had no one to help raise his children because Honor Francis died 2 weeks after her youngest child was born. So Daniel Wells went looking for a new wife. He found her about 35 miles away in the town of Sangerfield. Her name was Catherine Chapin, the granddaughter of David Chapin, the Revolutionary War man. Daniel married her in 1813, and their first child was Daniel H. Wells, born 1814 during the War of 1812. 2 years later, Daniel got another sister when his youngest sister, Catherine Wells, was also born to Catherine Chapin and Daniel Wells. Daniel Wells never got his real help on the farm that he wanted because when Daniel H. Wells turned 12, his father died suddenly. We don't know what from, but Daniel H. Wells didn't want to be a farmer, at least not in New York. And so in 1832, he sold the farm. And you can see in the square up there that it was sold by Daniel, his sisters, and their mother. In Daniel's case, it was his real mother. For 5 of the girls, their stepmother. They actually got about $450 for a 150-acre farm. Daniel had added 50 acres to the farm from his original 100. But farms were still selling at that time for around $4 to $5 an acre. After the farm was sold, Daniel H. Wells and his mother and his younger sister moved west again. Trenton, New York is located right close to the Erie Canal, which you see in the lower map. And that's a picture of the canal as it looked in the 1850s at the top. They moved all the way from Oneida County over to Buffalo, and then from Buffalo got on an Erie Canal boat and went all the way across Lake Erie to Cleveland, or at least the Cleveland area. There wasn't much of Cleveland at that time. Daniel was hoping to buy land there, but he found when he got there, most of the good land was already claimed, and what was left, he didn't have enough money to buy. He also got there too late to plant a crop, and too late to go on further to find some other place. So for the next winter, he stayed in Ohio and farmed himself out as a teacher. Educated people were fairly rare in the frontier area, which Cleveland was at that time. And so Daniel was able to get work as a teacher, and with it was able to support his mother and his younger sister and himself through the winter. Next spring, they moved on from Cleveland all the way to Illinois. We're not sure what caused Daniel to go to Illinois, except that there was land there, and he apparently saw an advertisement that said good land, good farming land was available along the Mississippi River in Illinois, which was then a fairly new state. This was in 1834. The place he found was called Commerce. It's on a big bend in the Mississippi River in southern Illinois. This is about what it might have looked like in 1834. When Daniel got there, there were about 60 people that had preceded him. Most of them were living on the lower bank of the river, kind of in the middle of the picture. But Daniel chose to buy a piece of property up on that bluff at the far right. And he purchased an 80-acre parcel of land at the top of the hill. So as you see in the text there, in 1835, he established himself in Illinois as one of the pioneers of Hancock County. Excuse me. He went to farming. From 1835 to 1848, he resided there. In 1839, the town became Nauvoo, and the Mormons arrived. Before the Mormons got there, Daniel was elected as a constable, then as justice of the peace. After the Mormons got there, he became an alderman on the city council, and he became commissary of the Nauvoo Legion and county coroner. As I said, there weren't too many educated people in the county, and those who were educated, even to a minor degree, wound up with a lot of responsibility. In 1836, Daniel turned 21 years old, and he had those positions the week afterward.
Was he a member of the church?
No, he had no connection with the Mormons prior to 1839. He did, however, in 1837 get married. The woman he married, who was 17 years old at the time, was Eliza Robison. This is one of the few pictures that exist of her. They married in 1837, and the next year they had a son, Albert Wells. I'll get out of chronological order by saying that Albert Wells was the only child that Daniel had with Eliza, and he never had any connection with the Mormons. He grew up with his mother in Nauvoo after Daniel left and came west. Eventually, he became an Episcopal priest, and he never married, and so his branch of the Wells family died out with him. I mentioned that Daniel bought 80 acres of farmland on the top of the hill. That square is his land. That block is the block on which the Nauvoo Temple stands. When you walk out the west door of the temple, you're standing on Wells Street. His home was about right there. Daniel H. Wells met Abraham Lincoln in 1839. There's a story that Lincoln came to Hancock County as the defense attorney for a man accused of murder for having killed somebody on a riverboat on the Mississippi. Daniel was the jury foreman. When Daniel H. Wells encountered Abraham Lincoln, the story goes that Lincoln said, "Get ready to die. I said if I ever met a man uglier than I am, I'd shoot him." To that, Daniel replied, "Go ahead and shoot. If I'm uglier than you, I don't want to live." From that kind of an introduction, they became friends, and Daniel, who was already a justice of the peace and an alderman in the city, began the study of law, and eventually himself became a lawyer. Lincoln was a little further advanced at that time in that proceeding, but they were associated together over the next 5 years whenever Lincoln came to Hancock County. Daniel had planned on being a farmer, but when the Mormons arrived, Commerce went from being a farm community to a metropolis in just a couple of years. There were soon 10,000 people in the town, and the price of land went from $5 an acre, which Daniel had paid for his, to $100 an acre, and then $100 for half an acre, and then a quarter of an acre. Daniel found people clamoring to get his land, and so he finally subdivided it into plots, attached it to Nauvoo City, and began selling land to church members on credit with long terms of payment. As I mentioned, he became an alderman. He was part of the Nauvoo Legion. He was a very prominent individual in the city, and most of the prominent citizens in the city, from Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram, through all the apostles and the other prominent LDS leaders, all had come before his court on various matters, from petty criminal activities to lawsuits to whatever. I found in his court records one individual named Samuel Smith. I thought it was the brother of the prophet Joseph Smith, but it turns out it was another guy. But he must have given fits to the prophet's brother Samuel, because he came before Daniel's court no less than 5 times for various crimes. And poor Samuel Smith, the prophet's brother, must have been mistaken for him many times. By 1844, Nauvoo would have looked something like this. It was a prosperous, growing city, and Daniel H. Wells was on his way to becoming wealthy. We're not sure how much actual cash he got, because he sold most of his land on credit, and by the time the Saints were driven out of Nauvoo, many probably hadn't paid for the land they purchased and later lost. But he was certainly among the more prominent citizens and the more well-to-do. His wife would have nothing to do with the Mormons, but Daniel, through his long association with Joseph Smith and other members of the church, gradually became converted and gained a testimony of the church, but he did not join it. As the conflicts between Mormons and non-Mormons in Nauvoo grew, Daniel decided to stay out of the church for a while in order to be a mediator between the LDS people and those who were opposed to them. the Nauvoo temple was nearing completion in 1844, Daniel sold the land on which the temple stood for $1,150 for that block to the church. And that was one piece of land that was paid for. On June 27, 1844, Joseph Smith was murdered, along with his brother Hiram. And that marked the beginning of the end for the LDS people in Nauvoo. Their enemies were determined to drive them out. Daniel did his best to mediate some of the disputes, but to no avail. The people who opposed the Mormons didn't want them to remain under any circumstances, and so there was really no possibility of mediating disputes. They feared, rightly, that Mormons were becoming so numerous that they could control Hancock County politics and perhaps even politics in the state of Illinois. And so, to avoid having the Mormons control their government, they were determined to drive them out. They were also opposed to polygamy, which they claimed that the Mormons were practicing. Most of the LDS people left Nauvoo by the spring of 1846. Daniel stayed. He was still not a Mormon. The remaining Mormons in Nauvoo were attacked in September of 1846 by a mob of about 1,000 members of the Illinois State Militia. This is a painting by C.C. Christensen of the Battle of Nauvoo, which pitted about 150 LDS who remained in Nauvoo against the mob of about 1,000 to 1,500. And the guy on the white horse, on the horse there, is Daniel H. Wells. He participated in the battle and led the people who were defending this part of the city to move over to here, where the mob was threatening to overwhelm the defenders, and thus was able to prevent the citizens from being overrun and the city taken by the mob. But it was only a temporary victory because the mob kept growing in numbers and the saints were diminishing in numbers and running out of ammunition. Plus, they didn't want to be going around killing people, even if the mob did. And so Daniel was able to broker a peace under which he had 3 days to surrender before the mob took the city. At that point, Daniel called on Alvin H. Babbitt, who was a prominent remaining Mormon in the city, to take him down to the Mississippi River and baptize him. He joined the church in the fall of 1846 when the fortunes of the LDS were at their lowest ebb. And by so doing, he sacrificed everything in his own life, all his property, all his wealth, and most importantly, his wife and his son, because his wife would not join the church, would not have anything to do with the Mormons, and would not leave Nauvoo. After participating in the Battle of Nauvoo, Daniel had no choice but to leave because the mob put a price on his head, and on September 20th, the mob entered the city and Daniel retreated to the river about 2 blocks ahead of the marching troops. He was rowed across the river, and a couple of cannonballs fired from the city followed after him. He took up one of the cannonballs and sent it to the governor of the governor of Iowa, telling him that his state had been invaded by a mob, but nothing was done. Along with Daniel, all the remaining LDS people in Nauvoo were driven out of their homes, sent across the river with shirts on their backs and nothing more. They were mostly the sick, the elderly, and a few children whose families had gone on ahead to prepare a way for them. Daniel immediately got into a wagon, a one-horse buggy, and rode 300 miles in 6 days to winter quarters, where Brigham Young and the rest of the saints were then camping, and brought back wagons of supplies for the saints who were still trapped on the river without anything, in an exposed condition. He went from there to winter quarters and then back again, all in about a 2-week period, gathering wagons and supplies as he went back to feed the hungry and helpless who were then in Montrose, Iowa, on the west side of the river. Daniel went back to Nauvoo to try and settle up his property after the mob agreed to allow him to return temporarily. His wife still would not join and would not go with him. He turned most of his property over to her. The rest he turned over to his younger sister Catherine, who also was not an LDS member. They moved them to Burlington, Iowa, on the west side of the Mississippi, so that they would be free of the anti-Mormon influence that now had taken control in Nauvoo. And in the spring of 1848, Daniel made a third trip west to winter quarters. The picture there is what winter quarters looked like in the spring of 1848, just as the saints were getting ready to move west. The first group, of course, had gone on in 1847 and were already established in Salt Lake. But a bigger group came in 1848. The group of wagons that Daniel was part of numbered more than 900 wagons, 2,000 head of cattle, and innumerable other animals, and about 2,000 people. If you can imagine a wagon train 4 wagons wide and 5 miles long, with cattle roaming on both sides and a monstrous dust cloud across the whole thing, you'll have some idea of what the trip was like. Brigham Young was making his second trip across the plains to the west. He appointed Daniel H. Wells to be his aide-de-camp and gave him the job of keeping the train together, helping stragglers to catch up, repair their wagons, keep their cattle together, and do whatever else was necessary to keep the train moving. They started on about June the 5th of 1848. They were on the plains for about 3 months, and on September 28th, Daniel H. Wells rode into Great Salt Lake Valley. He was released as aide-de-camp when they got to Utah, and immediately called to be the superintendent of public works. He held that position for the next 21 years. You might wonder what the superintendent of public works does. In Daniel's case, it was to build the city. This is about what Salt Lake City looked like. It was then called Great Salt Lake City in 1850. Plenty of streets and very few houses or anything else. These are some of the buildings that Daniel started building. He began with the council house, which was a church meeting place, a civic center, a government house. It served for everything in the early days. Then they built the old tabernacle, which stood on the corner, the southwest corner of Temple Square. And it was constructed by 1852. This is the tabernacle, and this is the Bowery. The Bowery was what we would call a pavilion, a picnic pavilion. Only instead of picnic tables, it had nothing but seats and an open roof with some bars across it on which they put the boughs of trees from limbs cut from trees in the neighborhood to give shade. And it was used in the summer to accommodate bigger crowds than could fit in the old tabernacle. Then in 1853, they built Social Hall. Some of you are probably old enough to remember Social Hall, which stood on about 50 South State Street on the east side of the street. There's a monument to it there now, but in the early days, it was the social center of the town. In the next 10 years, these are buildings that he also built in the first 10 years. The capital of Utah, well, the Deseret store and the tithing office stood where the Joseph Smith Memorial Building now is. And the endowment house, of course, was built on Temple Square to enable the saints to have endowments when they didn't have a temple. And then the Territorial State House was built in Fillmore when the state legislature decided that Fillmore should be the capital of Utah Territory. Just as they got the building built as far as you see it there, the legislature changed their mind and moved the capital back to Salt Lake City. And so that building still stands just as it was in 1855. You can take a tour there. But it was never used as a state house except in the summer of 1855, and the legislature met there just long enough to pass a law moving the capital back to Salt Lake. Besides being superintendent of public works, Daniel became attorney general of Utah Territory and a member of the Utah Territorial Legislature. This is the state of Deseret, which the saints proposed should be allowed to join the Union in 1849. Congress said no, and in 1851 they created Utah Territory instead and appointed Brigham Young as governor. That was the beginning of a long, long dispute and even warfare between Utah as a territory and the federal government. Daniel was also appointed by Brigham Young as the commander of the territorial militia, which was still called the Nauvoo Legion. The picture there is a picture of the Nauvoo Legion as it appeared in 1865. This was probably the height of its uniform appearance, because in the early days, they didn't have uniforms. Many of them didn't even have clothes. And so each man was required to provide his own clothing, his own horse, and his own arms. And they were a pretty motley group until after the Civil War, when a surplus of uniforms became available. The Nauvoo Legion fought its first engagement in Utah in the Indian War of 1850. That war took place in and around Fort Utah, which is now Provo. That's a drawing of Fort Utah. They suffered some Indian attacks that were actually a retaliation for one of the saints shooting an Indian, and eventually that war resulted in about 15 settlers being killed and about 75 Indians. When it was over, the Nauvoo Legion captured a group of Indians. They were brought back to Fort Utah and spent the winter in that lean-to shelter, which really isn't much of a shelter, before being released in the spring to go back to their tribe. Most of them were women and children. One of the people in this captured group was Black Hawk, who shortly thereafter became a chief in the Ute Nation and would later lead the Ute Nation in the Black Hawk War against the Mormons. Daniel H. Wells tried to befriend him, even took him to conference with him, and may have persuaded him to be baptized, although there's now no church record of that. And Black Hawk was clearly not following Mormon doctrine later in his life when he attacked the saints. Besides all of his church responsibilities, Daniel had to restart his family. Eliza was his first wife. He left her in 1848. In his view, she left him because in the 1840s, wives went with their husbands. Eliza did not. So when he arrived in Utah, Daniel married first Louisa Free in 1849. She is my great-grandmother. He married Martha Harris, a 17-year-old girl from Tennessee. Daniel was then 34. The next couple of years, he married the Alley sisters, Lydia and Susan, both of them from Massachusetts, and Hannah Free, who is the sister of Eliza Free. Hannah was 8 months pregnant with her first husband's child when he abandoned her, abandoned the church, and left town. When Louisa and her sister Emmeline Free brought her situation to the attention of Daniel H. Wells, he married Hannah. And then lastly, Emmeline Woodward, who was the divorced wife of a gentleman named Harris, and the widow of Newell K. Knight, who died in 1850, sent Daniel a letter saying, "You've married a lot of good women. Consider me." And so he did, and married her. Louisa had also been married previously to John D. Lee, with whom she had one son, John Brigham Lee. Daniel adopted John Brigham Lee, changed his name to John Brigham Wells, and raised him as his own son. Hannah Free's child became his at birth because Hannah was then married to him and she was born in the covenant. Emmeline had 3 children from her previous marriages, which she asked Daniel not to adopt because she wanted to preserve the heritage of Bishop Knight, who was their father. And so Daniel did not adopt those children, but he did raise them as his own. All 7 of those wives, well, all 6 of those wives lived in harmony with one another and with a total of 36 children over the next 40 years. With a family that size, Daniel had to find a way to support them. And so he became again an entrepreneur and a businessman. He got a concession from the legislature to take timber out of Immigration Canyon. The deal was that the legislature would give him permission to take the timber and charge for it, and in return he had to build and maintain the road up Immigration Canyon down which all the immigrants coming into the valley travel. So a man by the name of Killian was his gate master in the canyon and became the first resident of Emigration Canyon. For years, Daniel took timber out of that canyon. He also got a concession on the Green River Ferry. The Green River Ferry crossed the Green River in what is now Wyoming, but then was part of Utah, and was one of the last crossings that immigrants on either the Mormon Trail or the Oregon Trail had to make before arriving in Utah or cutting off to go to Oregon. And so the ferry was a critical transportation link. The charge was $1 for a wagon, 25 cents for each animal not hitched to a wagon. And what you see on the right there is a reconstructed version of the ferry that was built around the time of the bicentennial. Daniel also founded, with some other church leaders, the Big Cottonwood Lumber Company. And the Big Cottonwood Lumber Company harvested timber out of Big Cottonwood Canyon, starting at the bottom of the canyon, where they built a sawmill, and then moving up the canyon where additional mills were built over the next 50 years. The last mill was built where Brighton Resort now stands. And Brighton, whose first name I can't remember at the moment, was one of Daniel's employees in the sawmills, worked for him for about 30 years before getting his own land patent in the canyon and founding the Brighton community. As you can see in the pictures, the logs were cut and then hauled by oxen one at a time, and the sawmills were built in the canyon so that the lumber could be cut into more manageable pieces before they tried to haul it all the way down the canyon. Daniel H. Wells also went into coal mining with an English convert to the church, Stephen Taylor, who lived in Daniel's home when he first arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, and later married one of Daniel's children. He went prospecting with Daniel for coal. The state legislature offered a $1,000 reward for anybody who could find coal within 40 miles of Salt Lake, so that they wouldn't have to cut all the trees in the mountains for firewood. And so Daniel found a mine for the church and also the Wells and Taylor coal mine, for which he organized a company to sell private coal. You can see how tough the coal mining and the transportation was by these pictures. How'd you like to be dragging a coal wagon through that kind of mud? He also founded the Salt Lake Nail Forge. Nails were a hard commodity to come by because they're made of iron, they're heavy, and they had to be made by hand for the most part. So Daniel arranged to have a nail forge that you see on the left side of the picture, brought out to the valley, and then founded a forge to melt down iron and make nails. Nails were made by the forge in long strips, then cut into pieces, and a head put on them with a mallet and the points sharpened by hand. Before the forge was put in, nails were selling at $1 a pound. Afterwards, they were selling at 25 cents a pound. But Daniel was still making money. 10 years after the Saints arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, The Utah Expedition, otherwise known as Johnston's Army, was sent to Utah to subdue the Mormons. What you see there is what they were saying about us in the East. The community, and in part the civil government of Utah Territory, are in a state of substantial rebellion against the laws and authority of the United States. And the president said he's going to restore the supremacy of the Constitution and laws and prohibit in the territories those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. None of it, of course, was true, but the Mormon rebellion sparked an army. The army marched out of Fort Leavenworth in July and crossed the plains from July to October of 1857. They were 2,500 strong. Eventually, they were under the command of General Albert Sidney Johnston, a Southerner who hated Mormons and Northerners and pretty much everybody else who was from north of the Mason-Dixon line. It was a long march for the army, and they didn't have many stopping points except Fort Bridger in Wyoming and a few miles away from it, Fort Supply. Once the Mormons knew they were coming, they owned Fort Bridger and Fort Supply. Daniel H. Wells's brother-in-law, Lewis Robinson, owned Fort Bridger, and Daniel told him to burn it down, so he did. Then they burned Fort Supply so that the army coming would not have its supplies. Daniel took command of the Nauvoo Legion again, this time to fight the army instead of the Indians, with one difference. Brigham Young said, "You can't kill anybody." He established his headquarters in Cache Cave, which is right here, at the head of Echo Canyon. These are the cliffs of Echo Canyon, and this is the road down which all the immigrants came in the early days. Now, of course, it's a paved road. This is another shot of it. But they built fortifications that you see up here in these cliffs, ready to throw logs and rocks and hot coals down on the army should they attempt to pass on this road coming into the Salt Lake Valley. As it turned out, however, the army didn't get a chance to come through Echo Canyon because they needed about 2 million pounds of supplies for a 2,500-man army to get them through a winter. All carried across the plains by mules and wagons and oxen. Mormon raiders burned 3 of those trains. They destroyed 74 wagons and 300,000 pounds of supplies. Then they went on to capture 1,400 of the 2,000 cattle that the army had with them. This would be, of course, described as rustling. However, they did not keep the animals. When the conflict was over, they returned all the survivors back to the army. Marching armies and winter weather are hell on mules and other animals. Over 4,000 animals, horses, mules, cattle, died during the Utah Exposition. Almost all of them on the Army side. The Army was stopped mainly by weather. Snows came early in Wyoming and the Army just froze. They tried to break off from the main trail and go up onto Bear Lake. The Bear Lake Trail had come around from the north into Salt Lake, Another blizzard cut them off there. Finally, in November, they had to go into winter camp in the ruins of Fort Bridger, where they founded Camp Scott and a little town for the civilians called Ecclesville, named after a federal judge who was with the group. If you can imagine wintering in Wyoming in those tents, you get an idea why the Army got a little humbled. The next year, after the Army had had a few months to cool down in the wilds of Wyoming, Governor Cumming, the new governor, was allowed to come into Utah and was welcomed into office. Brigham Young turned over the governor's office to him without a complaint. He refused to give him his personal office, which was in his home, but he offered him the council house to have his office there. And the governor found that there was no rebellion. Eventually, a federal commission was sent to Utah, and they settled the whole matter with a couple of meetings in Great Salt Lake City. By then, Johnston's army was on the march, and he was still determined that he was going to put down the Mormons, but the governor wrote back to him and said, "You don't need to. Don't bring your army unless you can walk through and walk on." So Johnston finally brought his troops into Salt Lake City. Before he got here, the Saints evacuated the whole city, moved everybody to Provo, including all the apostles, the presidency of the church, and everybody living in the city, leaving only some fire crews to set fire to the city in the event that Johnston's army attempted to occupy it. So when the army finally got here, all they could get was the satisfaction of marching through empty streets. They sang dirty songs as they marched past Brigham's house, but he wasn't there to hear them. After the army passed through for the next many years, the Gentiles tried to take control of Utah away from the Mormons, but they failed. I'm looking at the time, and it's 8:15. I think I better stop there in just a moment. This is what Utah Territory looked like about 1860. In 1861, at the start of the Civil War, Nevada was chopped off. So was part of Colorado and what would later become Wyoming. This was an attempt by the government to reduce the influence of the Mormons and see if they couldn't get the Gentiles in charge by a legal vote. It didn't work. The next year, they chopped off a bigger piece of Utah and put it in Nevada. In 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, they chopped off another piece and put it in Nevada. The Gentiles eventually won control of Nevada, but not Utah. Daniel H. Wells continued to battle the military and the federal authorities in Utah over control of Utah Territory. During the Civil War, Utah had some additional Indian conflicts, and the Black Hawk War began. Federal soldiers were sent from California under the command of Colonel Connor to guard the mail routes from Utah to the east, but they wound up camping in Camp Douglas and refusing to help the Mormons with the Indian troubles at all. So the federal troops were only concerned with guarding the mails and preventing Confederate troops from taking the mails or stealing payments that were sent from California, and the Mormons were left to fight the Indians. Daniel H. Wells also helped found the Deseret Telegraph Company. This was a telegraph line that was built after the transcontinental telegraph was finished in 1861, replaced the Pony Express, and the Deseret Telegraph went all the way from Salt Lake City down to Arizona, to the Pipe Springs settlement, which is now the Pipe Springs National Monument. These are pictures from Pipe Springs, and Luella Stewart was one of the first female telegraphers who manned that line. It also went north into Idaho. Daniel H. Wells began his married life in Utah in this home, which stood on the place where the Joseph Smith Memorial Building now stands. In 1862, he moved to the Wells Mansion. This is a home that was originally built by Ezra T. Benson. But when President Brigham Young called Ezra Benson to pioneer again in Cache Valley, he sold the home to Daniel H. Wells, and all of Daniel H. Wells's family, except Emmeline and her children, lived in this house. Emmeline had a separate home on 3rd South, where she and her children from Bishop Whitney and her children with Daniel H. Wells all lived. If you can imagine this house with about 31 people living in it and no inside plumbing, you get an idea what pioneer life was really like. Now, if anybody would like to go on, I'll go on, but if you'd rather stop, we better stop before they throw us out. Any questions?
Yes, what finally happened to
Daniel H. Wells in 1866 became mayor of Salt Lake. He served there for 10 years. He was mission president of the European Mission twice, in 1864 and 5, and again in 1885 through 87. Then he was chancellor of the Deseret University for 10 years. And in 1888, when he came back from Europe for the second time, he became the first president of the Manti Temple. He served there for 3 years. When he couldn't stand anymore, the temple workers brought him back to Salt Lake City, where his wives could take care of him, and 2 weeks later he died.
And where is he buried?
He's buried in the Salt Lake Cemetery, which he helped found. Let me see if I can. Show you the place.
Any idea how many descendants he had?
Not for sure, but there are thousands. 26 of his 37 children did marry. Oops. Can't show you, I guess, where they. And most of them had pretty large families. My grandfather had 13 children by 2 wives, and many of the other children had large families as well. Daniel's children married into the Cannon family, the Sears family, the Young family. Most of the prominent pioneer families intermarried with the Wellses, and one of his daughters married Heber J. Grant and the Bennett family. And his son, Heber M. Wells, became the first governor of Utah.
No, Heber was his son or grandson?
Yes, Heber was his son. And I know Heber had 9 children, and not all of the children stayed in the LDS church, but most did. So there's got to be several thousand descendants now.
What was Daniel Wells to you?
He's my great-grandfather,
Great-grandfather?
and I'm his most important descendant.
Of course. Congratulations, sir.
My father was Calvin Wells. He's the son of Melvin D. Wells, who is Daniel H. Wells' youngest son.
Okay.
No, I take it back, not his youngest, his next to youngest. Daniel's youngest son was Bryant H. Wells, who became a general in the Army and served in the Spanish-American War and World War I with U.S. forces in France.
Very cool.
Any other questions?
This isn't a question, but I just want to commend you on all the amazing